Hello and welcome back to part 4 of this series where I'm explaining every reference in Donna Tartt's book, The Secret History. Today we are on to chapter number 4, and chapter number 4 is a really short chapter for this book. It's only 35 pages, and compared to the later chapters, that is just a breeze. And honestly, I think this could have been combined with chapter number 5 because they're both about explaining the Bacchanalia and then Bunny's involvement with it and how he figured it out. So I think these probably could have just been one chapter. And because this chapter is so brief, there aren't that many references in it. However, I do think my favorite reference in the entire book is in this one. And it was only my favorite reference after I looked into it. It's the one where Henry says some German, of course. You're going to hear all about this when I talk about it later in the video. But with all that said, let's get on into this chapter. On the first page of chapter 4, page 136, Richard says that he had translated an ode of Pindar's. Pindar was an ancient Greek lyric poet from Thebes. He's one of the canonical 9 lyric poets of ancient Greece, which basically means that later poets thought that his work was worth studying and preserving. Then on page 138, Richard says that he had brought a Raymond Chandler novel from home. Chandler was a crime novelist. He's best known for his book, The Big Sleep. And again, Richard is dipping into pop culture in his free time. On page 139, Richard finds Bunny watching a Laurel and Hardy. This is Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. They were a comedy duo that used a lot of slapstick. They're kind of similar to the Three Stooges. On page 142, Richard knocks on Henry's door and then says pause de response, which means no response. On page 145, after finding out about the tickets that Henry has bought to Argentina, Richard thinks, what was in Argentina? Borges, the writer, Butch Cassidy, they said, had gone into hiding there, along with Dr. Mengele and Martin Bormann. Jorge Luis Borges was an Argentinian short story writer. Butch Cassidy was an American outlaw who robbed banks and trains and is said to have fled to Argentina. I don't think he really did. He lived it out in America. Mengele was a member of the German Nazi Party. He is known for performing cruel experiments on captives. He did actually escape to Argentina after the war, and he lived there until he was quite old. But then he had a heart attack while he was swimming and he drowned, which luckily sounds like a very painful way to go. Martin Bormann was another high-ranking Nazi official. He is said to have been killed at the end of the war, but there are rumors that he lived and escaped to Argentina, although I don't think they're typically considered to be well-founded rumors. On page 147, when Judd and Frank ask Richard for money for a party, he thinks hoi polloi, barbaroi. This translates to the many barbarian. Richard is just insulting Judd. He's saying that he's one of the common folks, he's part of the rabble, and also that he's a barbarian. On page 155, Richard says that Bunny has Bob Hope's autobiography in his room. Bob Hope was an actor and a comedian. On the same page, Julian laughed and recited an aphorism from Xenophon, which was literally about tents and soldiers and the enemy nigh, but which carried the implication that in troubled times it was best to go to one's own people for help. We heard about Xenophon earlier on page 37, so I won't rehash that, but I want to cite the specific passage that Julian is quoting. This comes from Xenophon's Anabasis, Book 7, Chapter 4. And the quote goes, Xenophon came and told Suthius that his men were in bad quarters and the enemy were close at hand. He would be better pleased, he said, to bivouac in the open in a strong position than to be in the houses and run the risk of being destroyed. And so we don't actually get the quote, but that is what Julian was saying. On page 156, there's a poster of the Fleshtones, and that is a rock band. Also on this page, we hear about suicidal epithets from Artaud. This would be Antonin Artaud. He was kind of an edgelord. He was a writer, and he influenced cinema and theater. He was very avant-garde. On page 157, Henry played a disinterested bar of Traumerei on the piano with one hand. This is a piano piece composed by Robert Schumann. On page 159, there is a very interesting and subtle reference. Henry tells Richard that he never thought that he would come to his house bei Nacht und Nebel, and this translates to in the night and fog in German. However, that is not the interesting part. The interesting part is that this is the same name as a decree that Adolf Hitler issued in 1941 during the Second World War that allowed German authorities to abduct individuals alleged to be endangering German security. And then those individuals almost invariably disappeared and were never heard from again. This is really interesting because this is a subtle threat that Henry is throwing at Richard that Richard doesn't catch. Henry is saying that he hasn't decided if Richard is an enemy of the state yet, and he also hasn't decided if he's gonna have to make Richard disappear in the same way that he's planning to make Bunny disappear. And this is Henry knowing that Richard isn't gonna understand this reference because he doesn't think highly of Richard. Richard. He thinks that he's so much smarter than Richard, and that this is exactly the kind of thing that Henry, who's this polyglot, is going to be able to get past Richard and also feel smart. There's lots of instances in the book like this where Henry is arrogant. And I think that sometimes readers ignore that Henry does think really highly of himself. It's not just the other people around him. And he finds ways to use that intelligence to put down other people. And then there is a reference within this reference because the name of the decree comes from the poem The Elf King. That poem was written by the German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And in this poem, the Elf King tries to kidnap a young boy and ends up murdering him. And if you think this is a stretch of a reference, I would remind you that in this chapter, Richard references some pretty specific Nazis. And while I would agree that Mengele is a well-known Nazi, Martin Bormann is a little more obscure, and I think this shows that Donna Tartt herself, in a meta sense, has a good familiarity with this time period. And so I don't think it's a stretch that this is a reference that she is intentionally making. Although maybe she is just making a reference to the poem The Elf King, I find that a little hard to believe. On page 161, the Parker House in Boston is referenced. This is just a nice hotel in Boston, and we hear that it's where Dickens, meaning Charles Dickens, used to stay. Charles Dickens was an English author who wrote novels such as Great Expectations and A Tale of Two Cities. On page 162, Wendy and the Lost Boys are mentioned, which is a reference to some characters from Peter Pan. On page 163, the Bacchia is mentioned. I think they do a pretty good job of explaining it in the book, but I will recommend a more in-depth video from someone else about this. On page 164, Henry says that the group wore chitons during the ceremony. Chitons are basically a toga that was worn in ancient Greece and Rome. On page 165, Henry says that Pythia had chewed laurel leaves. Pythia was the title for the high priestess at the Temple of Apollo in Delphi. And the Oracle of Delphi was a priestess who would give prophecies and interpret visions for people seeking her wisdom and mystical knowledge. Henry then mentions the Pneuma Enthusiasticon, which people saw when they visited Pythia. These were vapors that surrounded the Oracle of Delphi when she was speaking to visitors, and they were perhaps hallucinogenic in some way. These have been reported by multiple sources, but exactly what they were and what function they served is still debated. On page 166, Henry mentions the Oribazia, which he says took place in midwinter. This was a nocturnal ceremony that was performed by priestesses of Dionysus in ancient Greece. Then, for the last reference of the chapter, Richard asks if the Dionysus that they saw had a thyrsus, which is a staff that Dionysus is typically depicted carrying. It's covered in ivy and vines, and a lot of the time it has a plant on the top, like a pine cone. And that wraps it up for chapter 4. Now, going back through this chapter, having had another chance to look at it, I am realizing that I forgot to talk about one of the references. This is on page 169 of my edition, and it's when we are hearing about Charles' memory of the Bacchia. And in his description, he says he was struggling with something, pulling as hard as he could, and all of a sudden becoming aware that what he was pulling at was a man's arm with his foot braced in the armpit. And this is actually very similar to a specific line in the play The Bacchia that goes, seizing his left arm at the elbow and propping her foot against the unfortunate man's side, she tore out his shoulder. And so obviously this whole scene, and really this whole book, is reminiscent and pays a lot of homage to this play. But this is a line that Donna Tartt is clearly pulling directly from. But other than that, this chapter is about the ceremony, so we do get some references into that. We do get back to a little bit of this Greek and Roman culture, which we've been missing out on in chapter 2 and 3 a little bit. But in chapter 5, we're going to get a little more back to the Greek and the Roman because we hear more about Henry and Bunny's time in Rome and Italy. And so it's just a little more relevant for that chapter. But this is a nice chapter. It's short. As I said at the start, probably could have been combined with the next chapter, but I will see you in the next one. I hope you learned something. If there's something that I missed, which I am sure there is, please let me know. And thank you for watching.